Welcome back to our lesson uh, where we're looking at uh, SQL. So in the previous lesson, we created a database, we created a table, we used the copy command to read in or to import data into our table. So now I want to use this second lesson to dive a bit deeper into SQL and how we can perform queries, which effectively means how can we ask the database questions so that we can get information from the data. Okay, so we call that querying the database. Okay, so we looked at the select command, okay, and we looked at the star, and we said something like from, let's say from stocks, okay. Now, before I execute this command, before I press enter, you'll notice that I've never mentioned what the star means. The star simply means all of the columns in the table, all right? So this select says, I want you to select all the columns in the table. Which table? Well, that's where the from command comes in. From is followed by the name of the table where you will be selecting the columns. Okay. So when I press enter, all right, I get back all the columns, all 4 columns. Okay. And I get back all the rows in this table. Okay. So this is a very generic query. It gives me back the table. Okay. Now let's do a bit of filtering, whereby we can ask for more specific information from the table. Let's say, for example, I want to find only the rows where the number of shares is greater than 500. Okay. By inspection, we should get 2 rows, right? Okay. So we're gonna say select, right? Again, I could say all the columns, but I could also say I only want the ID, okay, and the symbol and the num shares so that I can make sure that my query is correct. Okay, right? So instead of using the star for all the columns, I can say how many columns I actually want. Okay, now I have to say from which table, so I can simply say from stocks. Okay, and notice every time I press enter, I get another arrow. And the reason I keep getting arrows is because PostgreSQL knows that I am not finished writing the query. How does it know when I am finished writing the query? When it sees a semicolon. Okay, so this is the filtering. Okay, if I just leave this as is, it will just return to me all the rows again, except it will return 3 columns, but still all the rows. I don't want all 5 rows. I want specific rows. I want rows which the num shares is greater than 500. So what do? I use the where clause. So the where is like my filter. Where num shares greater than 500. Okay. Notice I get back 2 rows. And for those 2 rows, I want to get back 3 columns. The ID column, which I asked for here, the symbol column, which I asked for here, and the num shares column, which I asked for here. And I can inspect 1000 greater than 500, yes. 5000 greater than 500, yes. So the results are correct. So the where clause allows me to narrow down on the number of rows that are returned. All right, that's what the where is for. The where is a filter. It's a filter. Okay, so that is the where clause. All right. I could also, if I wanted, I could say select only the symbol where, from stocks where, right, the same thing, num shares greater than 500. Did I spell? Oh, okay. What is that comma doing there? Let's move that. Oh yeah, no comma should be there. Okay. All right. So instead of getting back the 3 columns, I only want the symbol column, right? And so I get Apple, APPL, and TSLA. Okay. So we will now move on to the idea of creating aliases or nicknames for your tables and for your columns. So there are many instances where you have to specify the table name. Okay, and so let's say the name of your table is this is a very long table name. All right, let's say that's the name of your table, a very long. You will have to type this name out every time you want to refer to the table. That will not be very convenient. So the database management system, the DBMS, Postgres, allows us to nickname our tables, to use a short name for our tables. Let me give you an example of that. Okay, and this is very useful. So you'll see that we will use this a lot in this course. So let's get used to it. I will say select S dot symbol, okay, from stocks as S. Let's say where S dot num shares greater than 100. Okay, so notice I am telling Postgres that from now on I will refer to my table stocks as S. Okay, so now I will simply say give me S dot symbol. So Postgres knows that I am referring to the stocks table and I want the symbols from the stocks table. Okay, and it works. Okay, so I could also, let's say I did not know how many rows were in my table. Okay, I could easily do that by using an aggregate, okay, which is an aggregate is a function that gives me a snapshot of the data. For example, if I ask for the number of rows, that's one number. If I ask for the sum of the shares that I own, that's a number. So an aggregate returns back to me a single value, right, which is quite useful. So let's try this one. Let's simply say select. Okay, and when you're using an aggregate, the first one is count. Count allows me to get how many rows there are in a table, and the way we do that, we simply put a star. Okay, so this is a pattern that you should follow. Count star allows me to get all the tells me how many rows are in the table, and of course I have to say from which table. I will say from stocks. Okay, notice I didn't say as S because I'm not using S in the select. Okay, only when you need to refer to the table in the select do we use the as. All right, so I'm not using any S up here, so I don't need to nickname or alias my table. Stocks is good enough. Notice I get back one value, which is the number of rows. Okay, all right, so that is what we refer to as an aggregate function. A-G-G-R-E-G-A, aggregate function. Okay, another example of an aggregate function is the sum. Okay, so let's say I wanted to find how many shares I owned. Okay, right, these are all the shares I own. How many total? Well, that's where the sum aggregate function comes in handy. So I can simply ask Postgres, okay, Postgres, can you return to me, okay, the sum of s dot num shares. Okay, notice I'm using s now. From stocks s. Okay, and it gives me back 6,670. Now, notice the name of the column is called sum after the aggregate. But if I wanted to change that and make it be something more appealing to me, I could simply say now as. So I can give an alias to a table, but I could also give an alias to a column. Okay, so I want to rename this the answer that I get. Whatever sum I get, I don't want to call it sum, right? I want to call it something unique. I could say um, total stocks owned. Okay. All right. That seems like a better name than just sum. All right. And see now, the column name is no longer called sum. It's called total stocks owned, which makes sense. All right. When I read that, I have a better understanding what this number means. If I just see sum, if somebody sees sum, they will ask you sum of what? All right, so this is another aggregate function. This is the sum function. Okay, of course they have like max, they have min, among others. Now, we've been looking at, by the way, one thing I want to mention, all these queries that I've been doing, you can actually include these queries as a file. Okay, so Let me show you, let me give you an example. Let's create a queries.sql. Okay, and you can write your queries in a file so that you can save it for later or for sometime down the road when you need it again. Okay, if I only run my queries, type them here, I lose them when I'm done, but I can save them. Similar to how I can create tables and save this, I could create queries and save it. So I could say select s dot symbol comma s dot date acquired from symbols, not symbols, or stocks as s semicolon. Okay, so of course I could give this a comment. The dates when stocks were bought, right? And so just like what I did earlier, I can run this /i queries.sql. Okay, and so I have my queries here, right? And they're saved, they're permanent. All right, so we've been talking a bit about queries, and so some you might be asking, well, how exactly does Postgres go about executing these queries? Well, it does it sort of a row by row approach. So let's say, for example, I want, let me create a new query. Say the stocks stocks where I own more than 200 shares. Okay, so this is my query. So I want the symbol, I want the num shares. Okay, let me get this. Okay, and now we have to say where s that num shares greater than, let's say, 200. Okay, so this is a command. Let's run. This is a query. Sorry, we get an answer. And so you might be asking, well, how is it that Postgres gives me back this? How does it do a query? All right, so let's look at the process. I'm just going to use this to kind of explain. All of you have written a program before, right? You've done at least one programming course. And I want you to think back to the idea of a loop, a for loop, okay, where you create a loop and you go through one by one. So the same thing applies with SQL. Okay, so Postgres, what it will do, you could say it's like saying for each row in my table, let's call my table S, I want to do the following. Okay, I want to check if that row num shares is greater than 200, then I want to output that row. Okay, so let's say maybe it's a function. Let's say row dot output. So no, not row output, but row dot the symbol and the row dot num shares. Okay. So in reality, SQL is doing a big loop. Okay, so what it will do, it will look through every single row, every row. Okay, let's look at that. Select all from stocks. Okay, so it will look at every row, one by one, one by one, and it will look at this row and it will say, okay, does the num shares greater than 200, right? And say, oh, okay, let's see, num shares greater than 200. Yes, it knows it needs to include that row in the answer it gives back to me. Then it will move on to the second row and it will check, is num shares greater than 200? Yes, it knows it needs to take this row and include it in my answer as well. And it does that for as many rows as they are in the table. Okay, and that essentially is how a query is executed by Postgres. It's just a loop where it loops through every row in the table and it tries to find or match the criteria or in this case the criterion that you requested, right? That you requested. So I hope that gives you sort of a mental picture as to how an SQL query gets executed. It's simply row by row, looking at each row, and if that row matches what I'm asking for, then Postgres knows to return that to me. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. The takeaway, you should know how to create an alias for a table as well as an alias for a column, like we did when we looked at the count, right? So we said select count. Okay, so this is an alias for a column. Let's call it as total rows, right, from south. All right, so this is an alias for this column. All right, so that's a column alias. Now this here is a table alias. Okay, we're creating another name for the table. We also learned about aggregates, right, such as count. We could also find the average if we wanted, the max, min, the sum, and so on. All right, so that's it. That brings us to the end of our lesson for this unit. And so I will see you in the next set of lessons.